Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I'm Deepak, joining you from India and delighted to host today's episode. It's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Fiona Denney as our distinguished guest on today's episode. Before we begin, allow me to introduce our guest for today's episode. Professor Fiona Denney is a professor of leadership and business education in the Department of Strategy, Entrepreneurship and Global Management at Brunel Business School, Brunel University of London, UK. Her work specializes in human-centered, compassionate leadership and hybrid management. With nearly 30 years in academia, she has held senior roles in academic development at institutions including King's College London and Brunel University of London, and has led strategic initiatives in researcher and staff development. Since 2020, she has been working in Brunel Business School and takes over as a MBA director for the school later this year. Her research, supported by a BA Liverhome grant, explores hybrid management in universities and across public and not-for-profit sectors. A principal fellow of the Higher Education Academy, fellow of the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Arts, Manufactures and Commerce, an experienced executive coach, she also works with organizations on leadership development and remains actively engaged with doctoral supervision and academic consultancy. She currently serves as an external examiner for the University of Lancaster and has previously examined at several UK universities, including UCL. She has also provided consultancy for APGM, a leading developer of online training programs for the higher education sector, and recently developed online courses in a partnership between Brunel and 1111, a sports management company. Dr. Fiona also works as a highly experienced executive coach to senior professionals in a wide variety of sectors. Today, Professor Fiona Denney joins us to discuss her research, working thematically, changing the path to leadership for the third space. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Fiona Denney to our podcast. Professor Fiona, we deeply appreciate your gracious acceptance of our invitation. It is an honor and privilege to host you today.
Thanks so much for inviting me, Deepak. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Professor, what prompted you and your co-author to explore leadership specifically in the third space of higher education? And how do you define this space for listeners who may be new to the term?
Yeah, it's a good question to start with. So this refers to work that I've done with Dr. Emily McIntosh, and also appears in, I have a chapter in the book that Emily and Diane Nutt edited on integrated practice in the third space. And Emily and I recently wrote an article that was published in the Journal of Learning Development in higher education on working thematically in the third space. And really our interest, both mine and that of Emily's, came from at various points being third spaces in higher education ourselves. And Professor Celia Whitchurch was the first person in academia to give a voice to the third space when she started to research it in the early 2000s. And she conceptualized it as new spaces in higher education that were at the interface between academic and professional activity. They're also referred to as blended professionals, and Professor Bruce McFarlane has also talked about the unbundling of the academic role in modern universities. Essentially, the third space is what we in the UK used to call academic-related roles, and they occupy quite complex and contested spaces, and I think we'll probably get into some of that a bit later. And as both Emily and I held such roles, it seemed that we were in a good place to research them and write about them and reflect on them.
Professor, you argue that future higher education workforce depends heavily on third space leadership. What makes this role so critical to universities' ability to navigate super complexity today?
Yeah, so I've been working in universities for about 30 years. And I've worked in a variety of universities, from what we in the UK call the new or post-92 universities, not so new now, and right through to the Russell Group and esteemed universities. I've seen an enormous amount of change in the sector in that time. And perhaps the biggest change of all has been operating in a truly global environment. And global environments bring with them enormous changes as everything becomes connected in a system. And when one part of that system changes, it impacts on the rest of the parts in the system. And we can see this really firsthand right now with the wars that are going on that have put squeezes on finances and, on access to various parts of the world that we thought we had easy access to previously that we don't now. Changes in leadership in one country can impact on whether students from other countries want to go there and study and so on. As a result, the traditional hierarchical models of universities that we're very familiar with are not flexible enough to be agile for these changing situations where things can really change very, very quickly, and where that one change then has an impact on all the other parts in the system. So agility, I think, is going to be key for future survival of universities. As a result, having people leading who understand both the professional services side of universities as well as the academic ethos and practices is going to be absolutely crucial in building and sustaining that agility and enabling universities to respond very quickly. People who can bridge the two worlds that really we have in universities are likely to be able to support other people in more effective collaborations and rapid responses. Emily and I think we agree with Professor Jonathan Grant, who also writes on this. He says that important leadership opportunities will emerge from the third sector in the future. And I think with everything being so much part of these hyper-connected global systems, really it's that sort of sense of connectivity across the different pieces that will be so important for the future of universities.
Professor, can you unpack what you mean by working thematically in universities and how this way of organizing work contrasts with traditional departmental or hierarchical structures?
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of already alluded to some of that, but we really conceptualized working thematically to describe a way of organizing university activity around cross-cutting strategic priorities. So you could think of that in terms of things like student success, widening participation, digital innovation, sustainability, rather than just around fixed departments or functional silos. So instead of focusing work and containing it within a single faculty or a single service, thematic working brings together academic staff, it brings together staff in professional services, and also possibly external partners into collaborative groupings that are then focused on solving a shared problem or a shared goal. In practice, this would involve fluid cross-functional teams that cut across the organisational boundaries, which would often be time-bound or project-based and would rely more heavily on coordination, negotiation and relationship building rather than formal lines of authority. Now, I appreciate that many of your listeners are probably saying, well, we've had that for decades in industry. But in universities, this is something that's actually quite different. Third spaces become quite central to this model because they're the people who are able to join the dots across the institutional domains, particularly at more strategic leadership levels. And they will then enable work to progress through that additional sense of collaboration and relationship building. And otherwise, these areas would actually remain quite disconnected. So working thematically then becomes less about where you sit in the organisation and more about what institutional challenge is being addressed collectively by all the people coming together. It's likely to involve authority, which is much more distributed and relationship based, and where the roles that people occupy are going to be more fluid, often hybrid roles, and may evolve with the task. So the move towards thematic working really reflects that super complexity that we've already talked about. Challenges that universities are facing today can't be solved by one department. You can't solve it by, the HR department doing something different or the business school, just recruiting more students on their own. It's not possible. These things are so much more connected and a part of an holistic picture. And as a result, we find that really the traditional structures in universities are too rigid to enable universities to be that agile. So working thematically would enable more quick adaptivity to the changing environment that universities are finding themselves in now.
Since the paper highlights the third space professionals are often invisible in key metrics like student-staff ratios. How does this invisibility affect both their recognition and their path to leadership?
Yeah, I mean, this is part, I think, of an evolving picture, and I think it's important to reflect on the current situation in most universities, certainly within the UK, and I think this is reflected more globally too. Senior roles in universities tend to be obtained either from an academic route or from a purely professional services route. So we find that vice chancellors almost always have these stellar research backgrounds. That's usually a requirement when you see the job description. And chief operating officers have come through leading finance or being an HR director, for example. You rarely get anybody in the very senior leadership roles who have come from being an academic liaison librarian, for example, a subject specialist librarian, or from sort of academic or researcher development. Although there have been outliers to this, and I have written a paper on this as well, and sort of shout out to people who have come through, in particular, the academic development route and educational development routes to lead universities. Sian Waring at Middlesex University, for example, is one. And what happens is that we are still counting student staff ratios in the same way that we have done previously, where we're only counting the academic staff. And we're missing the contributions that people in the third space make to things like student experience. Student staff ratios is just one example of this. But we often have third spacers who sit on project groups contributing to cross-institutional strategic priorities. They're usually really well networked with their peers because there aren't too many in any one role in any one university. So they're usually really well networked across the sector. So they've got great sector knowledge and that understanding of the web of universities and what other universities are doing at any one time with strategic priorities. But they struggle to get promoted because they don't fit neatly into these boxes or silos that we've got for them. They're not neatly into the academic promotions process, and they don't fit neatly into progressing through a professional services role either. And I think this is really to the detriment of universities. We end up losing a lot of talent from the third space roles because people just move around. That they feel they've done their time in their role in their university, and so they look for a step up, but in another university, or something equivalent, but in another university. And so we lose a lot of that talent, I'm afraid. Universities could really, really benefit from that breadth of knowledge and experience at a more senior level, and we need to address that pipeline. We've got a very leaky pipeline in this area.
Professor, you draw on ideas of super complexity and complex collaboration. Could you share a concrete example of how third space leaders manage these challenges in day-to-day university life?
Yeah, so what we're thinking about here is the thematic working, where universities bring staff together from across academic and professional domains to respond to complex challenges. So we might find, for example, somebody in the third space coordinating a cross-institutional initiative to enhance the student experience. And I think that would be quite a common example. So in this type of thematic working, we would want to involve academic staff, student services, data teams, external stakeholders, students themselves, all of whom operate with different priorities, different metrics, and different ways of working. And this reflects the idea of super complexity, where there aren't just multiple perspectives, but the frameworks for evaluating success are themselves up for debate and up for discussion. So you've got different people measuring success in different ways. And that question of how do we know when we've been successful, I think is actually a really important one for this kind of thematic working. So the third spaces would manage this by joining the dots across the institution, using their networks, connecting the disparate strands of activity, translating between different professional languages and between professional languages and academic languages, which is, a really interesting area, and supporting collaborative sense making. So this is what the paper refers to as complex collaboration. It's not simply coordination, but it's about working across boundaries where roles, identities, often, or even authority, are often unclear. We're not quite sure who's in charge here. It requires operating within matrix structures for sure, as I've already mentioned, but it's very, very heavily dependent on the things that the third spaces are really good at, which is building coalitions and networks and relationships. And they're also very good at maintaining progress despite ambiguity and priorities that could actually be shifting as things change. So in practice, it's very much less about formal authority and more about relational influence, about adaptability, and about the ability to navigate uncertainty while keeping those institutional projects moving forwards.
Professor, one of your proposals is to rethink university contracts, including the idea of academic strategic contracts. What would this look like in practice, and how might they change career progression for the third space colleagues?
Yeah, I mean, this really goes back to what I was saying just a minute ago about the progression to the senior leadership roles in universities. Current university contracts actually really fail to reflect the realities of third space work, particularly the hybrid nature of roles that combine both academic and strategic responsibility. So I think if we were looking at introducing academic strategic contracts, we would want to formally recognise that type of hybridity. In practice, we'd be looking at roles that explicitly combine academic, professional, and strategic leadership functions. We often get people who have come from an academic background into the third space roles, so that they often have a PhD, they may have done postdoctoral work, they may have publications, and they've decided that a pure academic route is really not for them. So what happens is they move into a role where their academic expertise forms a crucial sort of foundation for the job they're going to be doing, but they end up on a professional services contract. And what happens then is that they can then be quite frustrated with the limits for being able to progress. And I think we've really got to rethink the contract around what they're actually doing and around the value that they are bringing to the institution. So we might want to think about, rewarding things like institutional impact, collaboration, innovation, cross-institutional impact as well, because as I've mentioned, a lot of people in the third spaces are extremely well networked. They're part of network and sector groups, often leading those groups, and they understand the landscape of higher education better than a lot of academics do. And so we really need to have a look at what we are rewarding and recognising in terms of contracts. And that would obviously impact on career progression. At the moment, our third spaces are often facing quite limited advancement because their contributions are not fully recognised within traditional academic pathways. If we went to something like academic strategic contracts, we would look at legitimising those third space roles, and they would become part of the core university workforce. And we'd be looking at having pathways into senior leadership. And it would really get universities, I think, to rethink the deeply embedded hierarchies that we're currently struggling with. So really what we're trying to encourage some thought around is around aligning institutional structures with the realities of contemporary university work, where boundary spanning, collaborative leadership is really essential to institutional longevity, agility, and success.
Professor, in question whether a stellar research record should remain the main criterion for senior leadership roles. What alternative criteria or evidence of leadership readiness do you believe universities should prioritize instead?
So, in your introduction to me, Deepak, you mentioned work that I had funded by the British Academy and Leverhulme Trust. And this was a project that I did with a colleague, Alexandra Budjanov Cannon, at King's Business School, King's College London. And we looked into the roles and experiences of academic heads of department. And one of our surprising findings, we interviewed about 70 academic heads of department. And we were really surprised to find that actually quite a number of them had external leadership and management experience, or management experience gained from a role within their academic department as well. But we rarely make that explicit when we're talking about progression in academia. Locally, these people are known to their peers as having already done management, and therefore we think they'd be good for head of department or, faculty dean or whatever. But we're not actually making that explicit. We're not looking beyond the stellar research record in an explicit way at any step in the organisation. Instead, we sort of say, well, so and so's been a really good researcher. They've made a lot of contributions to the department in terms of their research and their teaching. So we think they'd be a really good head of department. And to take on the line management authority and sometimes budgetary management authority as well. And that actually, just because you can do the one doesn't mean you can do the other. But there are quite a number of people in the academic sphere who already have that experience. And I think we need to be making that much more explicit when we talk about senior leadership roles. So I'm not suggesting that for senior academics, for the Vice Chancellor, we say we don't want them to have a stellar research record. But actually, we need to look beyond that, and we need to look at where people have come from and what else they've been doing. And some of the leadership roles that our heads of department in this study had done was actually, it was really quite impressive in terms of the leadership and management they'd done before they came into being a head of department. So I think we need to have conversations around, how we can support people in going into leadership and management roles, and how we can make those things more explicit if you want to progress in an academic career. And then we may well end up with better caliber of people, having more of a balance between the academic side and the leadership and management side. And then, of course, what we're also doing is there's also the potential for opening up more of those very senior roles to people who've come from a more hybrid background, and via the third space route. Interestingly as well, I think just worth saying, in the project with Ali at King's College London, we also found that a number of people had talked about having attended leadership development courses, even when they weren't in a leadership role at the time. These were very few organisations, but there were some in the sample. And these organisations these universities had provided an opportunity to attend a leadership development course so that people could indicate that they were interested in taking on leadership roles in universities and were able to get some preparation for it. So I think most universities probably need to do much more in that area. Universities generally are very poor at talent management and succession planning generally right across the piece. And I think we've got to get much better at that for the sake of having a more sustainable leadership pipeline.
Professor, the paper suggests that excluding third space professionals from leadership groups can amount to a form of discrimination. How have you seen this play out, and what cultural shifts are needed to address it?
So generally, I think this is based on ignorance rather than sort of deliberate attempts to discriminate in any way. I think it's ignorance largely of what third space professionals can contribute. And the biggest cultural shift from my perspective would be to move beyond the binary divide that we have at the moment. And we tend to refer to this as academic or non-academic. And that's a term I particularly dislike, because you shouldn't define people by what they're not. So I always tend to refer to the binary divide as being academic and professional services, but I think it makes it more stark if we think about it as academic and non-academic. It would be helpful if we could all start to understand the university as a system, and that it's a system that we're supporting in various ways, and that we start to recognise the value and the skills of third spaces in bridging those divides and contributing to the well-being of the system. Often you find, for example, academic developers, for example, are very skilled at referring to their own academic work and background when they're running workshops for academics. And they can be very flexible around navigating different language norms for different disciplines. So they tend to be highly experienced at understanding how the university works, what each area contributes, and they will use language that bridges divides, such as between professional services and academic areas, or even within academic areas between science and humanities, for example. And there's a lot that could be learnt from them to support changes in cultural shifts, and enabling each university to see itself as a system, and then to see its own system within a wider web of systems as well. And I think that's really where we need to go in terms of cultural shifts. We're a long way off that. I think there is work that is progressing in that area now, but I think we're quite a long way off from being able to see it as a system.
Professor, many third space professionals already lead complex cross-institutional projects without formal recognition. How can universities better surface and value this boundary-crossing leadership?
Yeah, it's a challenging question, isn't it? So, whereas academics are often recognised for taking on a role in their department, such as director of research, director of teaching, head of department, as I've already alluded to, that explicitly contributes to their promotion criteria. But third space professionals usually are on professional services contracts, and they're not eligible for promotion in the same way. So typically, they'll take on project leadership roles as part of their jobs, but they're not formally recognised in promotion criteria. So I'm sort of really talking about the typical UK context here, and I think this may differ in other cultures. But traditionally in the UK, if you're on a professional services contract, then in order to progress, you would need to actually ask for the role to be regraded. And that can be quite a difficult process, and quite complex to navigate. There isn't a promotions process, not in many places anyway, in the same way that it works for academics, and I think that we're familiar with for academics. And I think firstly we've got to address that. So when we ask people to take on complex project roles, we need to make sure that they're being rewarded for those. And I think that we've therefore got to look at promotion criteria for non-academic staff, and we've got to figure out how we can enable that pipeline, and that pathway, to connect up for professional services staff, unless we introduce a third type of contract. So at the moment we've got academic staff and we've got professional services staff, and we need to look at the promotion criteria for professional services staff if we say we're going to keep those two types of contracts, essentially. We also, I think, need to recognise the value from external awards. So in the UK, we've got Principal Fellow of Advanced HE, we've got National Teaching Fellow, we've got Collaborative Awards for Teaching Excellence. These are open to all staff, including third spaces, and many third spaces have won recognition at those national levels. But internally, in a lot of universities, they're only understood as being teaching excellence awards with some kind of dismissive attitude around them. And actually, there's a lack of understanding about the complex skills, the demonstration of leadership, the contribution to strategic projects and priorities that people who have obtained those awards, have won those awards, have contributed to. And I think we need to be integrating those kinds of recognitions into a much more sort of strategic pathway for people in the third space and in professional services. I think these kinds of awards often highlight that very important systems thinking approach to problem solving, which I think is absolutely foundational in terms of the success and agility of universities going forwards in today's climate.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. If a vice chancellor or governing body is listening and wants to change the path to leadership for the third space, what are the first 2 or 3 practical steps you would urge them to take?
So I think the first thing is to recognise that the issue is not one of lack of capability in third space professionals, but it's a misalignment between institutional structures that tend to be quite historic in origin and the realities of contemporary university work, particularly in the super connected world. So I think from that, I would look at 3 things. I would look at making third space work visible and formally recognised. So auditing it across the institution, looking at what's happening. A lot of it's currently hidden in plain sight. We need to make sure that what is essential to institutional functioning but isn't adequately captured in formal role definitions or reward structures is actually has some light shone on it, and we actually understand who's doing it and what they're doing. So to map some of that, build it into workload models, promotion criteria, and to look at things like that. So to start to make it visible and build a leadership pathway around it. Then I'd look at redesigning the career pathways through academic strategic contracts. So looking at whether we could actually create some kind of formal career pathway that reflects hybrid roles rather than forcing individuals into these silos of academic or professional services. And academic strategic contracts would really recognise roles that combine academic credibility with institutional leadership and delivery, and would really value those skills that I've talked about relationship building, networking, impact, collaboration, solving complex problems really by bringing people together. And then look at organising work around themes rather than structures. So looking at the agile thematic ways of working, and also identifying the issues that the traditional hierarchical structures have in accommodating the kind of cross-boundary collaboration that really we're dependent on. So we're looking at establishing cross-functional teams and empowering people in the third spaces to coordinate those and to have authority across different departments to try and sort of bring down those silos, break down those bridges and those barriers. So really, I mean, I think those things could significantly shift third space work from being informal and invisible and essentially structurally marginal to being recognised, supported and recognised as being core to institutional leadership. And really recognising the importance of the work that they do and could do more of to support our universities from a systems-based perspective in a super connected world.
Thank you, Professor Fiona, for sharing your research insights and experiences with us today. It has been a valuable conversation. We appreciate your time and reflection on leadership, and we hope our listeners feel inspired to continue exploring these ideas in their own context. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deepak.